My name is Joaquin Rivera. I'm a cartographer, and I survived the first night of the zombie outbreak at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix. When the infected started pouring through those emergency room doors, my maps and navigation skills became the difference between life and death. I watched my best friend get bitten, navigated through corridors filled with the undead, and used my professional knowledge to escape a city overrun by zombies. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I need to tell you what happened at St. Mary's Hospital on the night everything changed. I'm a cartographer by trade, which means I make maps and navigate terrain that most people never see. For the past 10 years, I've worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, mapping remote wilderness areas across the American Southwest. I've spent countless nights alone in places where your GPS won't work and your cell phone is just a paperweight. I thought I knew what isolation felt like. I thought I understood what it meant to rely on your own skills to survive. I was wrong. What I'm about to share with you might save your life if something like this ever happens again. Every detail I'm giving you, every decision I made that night, it all came down to the skills I'd learned over years of surveying dangerous terrain. The difference between making it through that first night and becoming one of those things came down to preparation, observation, and understanding your environment. These aren't just survival tips. This is what kept me breathing when the world fell apart. It was October 15th, 2024, a Tuesday night that started like any other. I wasn't supposed to be at the hospital at all. My friend Miguel Castillo had been in a motorcycle accident earlier that evening around 7:30. Some drunk driver ran a red light downtown and sent Miguel sliding across Central Avenue. The paramedics brought him to St. Mary's Hospital emergency room, and his sister called me because I was listed as his emergency contact. Miguel and I had been friends since college, and we'd kept each other's backs through some rough times. I arrived at the hospital around 8:45 that night, carrying my leather satchel like I always do. It's become such a habit that I feel naked without it. Inside that satchel, I keep backup maps of whatever area I'm in, a reliable compass that belonged to my grandfather, emergency water purification tablets, a small first aid kit, and a few energy bars. Most people think it's overkill for city life, but my work has taught me that you never know when you'll need to navigate without technology. That satchel saved my life that night, though I didn't know it yet. The emergency room waiting area was typical for a Tuesday night. Maybe 15 people scattered across those uncomfortable plastic chairs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting everything in that sickly hospital glow. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine near the triage desk and settled in to wait. The nurse told me Miguel was stable, but they needed to run some tests, so it might be a while. I didn't mind. I'd spent plenty of nights waiting in worse conditions. While I sat there, I did what I always do in unfamiliar buildings. I mentally mapped the layout. It's an occupational habit that served me well over the years. I noted the main entrance, the emergency exits, the elevator locations, and the stairwell access points. The hospital was built in the 1970s, typical concrete and steel construction with wide corridors and multiple levels. From what I could see, there were at least 6 floors, with the emergency department on the ground level. The building sat on a slight elevation compared to the surrounding downtown area, which would provide some tactical advantages if you ever needed to observe the surrounding streets. I also made note of the hospital's position relative to Phoenix's major transportation arteries. We were about 3 blocks east of Interstate 17 and maybe 6 blocks south of Interstate 10. That intersection represents one of the most critical traffic choke points in the entire Southwest. During my surveying work, I'd mapped the underground utility tunnels that run beneath this part of downtown. Most people don't realize that Phoenix sits on top of an extensive network of maintenance tunnels, drainage systems, and utility corridors. It's information that becomes very important when normal transportation routes are compromised. Around 10:15, I noticed the emergency room staff becoming more active. More nurses appeared at the triage desk, and I could see security guards positioning themselves near the main entrance. The head nurse, a woman with graying hair who looked like she'd seen everything, kept checking her phone and looking toward the ambulance bay. Something was happening, but I couldn't tell what. I have an amateur radio license, which I got years ago for my remote surveying work. When you're mapping areas where cell towers don't reach, ham radio becomes your lifeline to civilization. That night, I had a small handheld radio clipped to my belt, and I could hear increased chatter on the emergency services frequencies. The dispatch calls were becoming more frequent, and I started picking up references to multiple incidents in the warehouse district about 4 miles northwest of the hospital. The warehouse district sits in one of the lowest elevation areas of central Phoenix, right along the Salt River bed. It's an industrial zone with poor drainage and limited access roads. If something was spreading through that area, the geography would naturally funnel people toward the higher ground where the hospital sat. Basic topographical analysis suggested that anyone fleeing the warehouse district would naturally move southeast, directly toward our location. At 10:47, I heard the first ambulance approaching. The siren cut through the normal hospital noise like a knife, and I could tell from the pitch and intensity that whoever was driving was pushing hard. The automatic doors at the ambulance bay burst open, and paramedics rushed in with a patient on a gurney. Even from across the waiting room, I could see something was seriously wrong. The patient was thrashing against the restraints with an intensity I'd never seen before. The movements weren't random or panicked like you'd expect from someone in shock or pain. They were aggressive, predatory, with a rhythm that reminded me of the way wild animals behave when they're hunting. The sounds coming from the gurney weren't human screams or cries for help. They were guttural moans mixed with what I can only describe as snarling. One of the paramedics, a young guy who looked like he'd seen combat based on his posture and the way he moved, shouted to the triage nurse as they wheeled the patient past. Bite victim from the warehouse district. Found him in the loading dock of Morrison Freight, chewing on his coworker's arm. Took 4 of us to get him restrained, and he kept trying to bite anyone who got close. The nurse's face went pale. She'd been working emergency medicine long enough to handle overdoses, gang violence, and car accidents without flinching. But something about this case was different. She immediately called for Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, and I could hear her requesting additional security to the treatment area. I stayed in my seat, but every instinct I'd developed during years of working in dangerous terrain was telling me to pay attention. When you're surveying remote areas, especially places where people have gotten lost or injured before, you learn to recognize patterns that indicate danger. The behavior of the hospital staff, the increasing radio chatter, and the geographical pattern of incidents all pointed to something spreading outward from a central location. At 11:15, the second ambulance arrived. This time, I got a better look at the patient as they wheeled him through the waiting area. It was a woman in her 30s, wearing what had been a business suit before it got torn and covered in blood. The blood wasn't from any visible wounds on her body. It was around her mouth and under her fingernails, like she'd been the one doing the attacking rather than being attacked. But it was her eyes that made my skin crawl. They were completely vacant, like looking into the eyes of a dead fish. There was no recognition, no awareness, no human intelligence left. Just hunger, pure animalistic hunger. She kept snapping at the air with her teeth, making that same snarling sound as the first patient. The paramedic team looked shaken. These were people who dealt with trauma every day, but they were handling this case like it was infectious. They wore full protective gear and kept their distance from the patient even with her strapped down. One of them mentioned to the nurse that they'd found her in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, attacking customers who were trying to get to their cars. I pulled out my phone to check the local news, but the websites were already overloaded with traffic. What little information I could get suggested multiple violent incidents across the warehouse district, all involving what reporters were calling extreme aggressive behavior and unprovoked attacks on civilians. The pattern was expanding outward from the industrial area, following the natural traffic flow through the city. By 11:30, 3 more ambulances had arrived. Each patient showed the same symptoms: violent aggression, attempts to bite medical staff, complete loss of human cognitive function, and that same predatory behavior. The emergency room was transforming from a medical facility into something that felt more like a containment center. I started noticing other changes too. The emergency services radio chatter was becoming more desperate. Police units were calling for backup that wasn't arriving. Fire departments were reporting that they couldn't reach certain areas of the warehouse district. The few news reports that were getting through mentioned that several police officers had been severely injured while responding to calls, but they weren't giving details about the nature of those injuries. The hospital staff was adapting quickly, but I could see the strain building. They were treating each new patient as a potential biohazard, which was slowing down their response time. Security guards were being positioned at every entrance, and I noticed they were carrying equipment I'd never seen in a hospital before. Riot gear, extended batons, and what looked like pepper spray. Dr. Chen appeared in the waiting area around midnight, looking for Miguel's family. I identified myself as his emergency contact, and she told me that Miguel was stable, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation. Under normal circumstances, I would have just gone home and checked on him in the morning. But these weren't normal circumstances. I asked Dr. Chen about the unusual patients they'd been receiving, and her response told me everything I needed to know. She'd been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, and she'd never seen anything like this. The bite victims weren't responding to sedatives. They showed no signs of pain response, and they seemed to have lost all higher brain function while retaining basic motor skills and aggressive instincts. More disturbing was what she told me about the progression. The patients who had been brought in earliest were showing signs of deteriorating vital signs, but their aggressive behavior was intensifying. 2 of them had actually died on the treatment tables, but their bodies continued to move and attempt to bite staff members. She'd ordered the bodies to be restrained and isolated until they could figure out what was happening. I decided to stay at the hospital that night. Something was seriously wrong, and my experience in remote areas had taught me to trust my instincts when environmental conditions start changing rapidly. The patterns I was observing suggested a situation that was spreading and escalating. The geographical distribution, the timing of incidents, and the behavioral consistency across multiple victims all indicated that this wasn't random violence or drug-related incidents. Around 12:30, the power fluctuated for the first time. It was just a brief flicker, but it was enough to make everyone in the emergency room look up at the lights. Power grids don't typically have problems unless something is affecting major infrastructure. The hospital had backup generators, but a power fluctuation suggested that whatever was happening was beginning to impact critical systems across the city. I checked my radio again and noticed that several emergency services frequencies had gone quiet. Units that had been reporting regularly were no longer responding to dispatch calls. The few communications that were getting through included references to "officer down," situations and requests for military assistance. That's when I realized that my decision to stay at the hospital might not have been about loyalty to Miguel. My subconscious had been processing all the environmental indicators and warning signs, the same way it would alert me to changing weather conditions or unstable terrain during a surveying expedition. Something catastrophic was building, and I was about to find myself using every survival skill I'd ever learned just to make it through the night. At 12:45, the hospital's main communication system failed. The phones went dead, the internet connection dropped, and even the internal paging system stopped working. We were cut off from the outside world right when we needed information the most. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. The radio frequencies were becoming increasingly chaotic, with overlapping emergency calls and reports of violence spreading across multiple districts of the city. That's when I heard Miguel screaming from somewhere deep in the hospital corridors, and I knew I was about to find out just how bad things had become. Miguel's scream cut through the hospital chaos like a knife, and I knew immediately that whatever was happening to the other patients had reached him. The sound wasn't pain or fear. It was rage, pure animalistic rage mixed with something that barely sounded human anymore. I grabbed my leather satchel and headed toward the elevator bank, but the security guard stationed there stopped me. "Sir, we can't let anyone upstairs right now," he said, but his voice was shaking. This guy was built like a linebacker and had probably handled every kind of hospital disturbance you could imagine, but he was scared. Really scared. "We've got a situation developing on multiple floors." I could hear it too. What had started as isolated incidents in the emergency room was spreading upward through the building. Screaming, crashing sounds, and that same inhuman snarling I'd been hearing from the bite victims. The elevator behind the security guard dinged, and when the doors opened, two nurses stumbled out. Their scrubs were torn and bloody, and they were supporting each other as they moved. "Fourth floor is lost," one of them gasped to the security guard. "The patients in the isolation ward broke containment. They're attacking everyone, and the ones they bite are turning aggressive within minutes. Dr. Martinez tried to sedate one of them, and it tore his throat open. Then Martinez got back up and started attacking the other staff." The security guard's radio crackled to life. "All security personnel to the third floor immediately. We have multiple code grays in progress and need emergency lockdown procedures initiated." Code gray meant combative person, but the way the dispatcher's voice was breaking suggested this was far beyond anything their protocols were designed to handle. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of arguing with security or trying to force my way past them, I used the knowledge I'd gained from mentally mapping the building earlier. During my surveying work, I'd learned that most institutional buildings from the 1970s were constructed with service corridors and maintenance access routes that paralleled the main hallways. These were designed for utility workers and equipment transport, and they typically weren't monitored as closely as public areas. I told the security guard I was going back to the waiting room, but instead, I headed toward the restrooms near the ambulance bay. Just past the men's room, there was a maintenance door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The lock was a standard industrial deadbolt, but I'd noticed earlier that the door frame was slightly warped, probably from years of temperature changes and settling. A little pressure in the right spot, combined with lifting the door slightly to relieve pressure on the bolt, and it opened. The maintenance corridor was exactly what I'd expected. Concrete walls, exposed piping, and service elevators that connected to every floor of the building. My grandfather's compass, which I always carried in my satchel, helped me maintain orientation as I navigated through the unfamiliar passages. The compass had been his most prized possession during his surveying career in the 1960s, and it had never failed me during my own fieldwork. I could hear the chaos intensifying throughout the building as I made my way toward the service elevator. The hospital's public address system kept cutting in and out, with fragmented announcements about lockdown procedures and evacuation protocols. But what concerned me most was what I was hearing on my radio. Emergency services across Phoenix were reporting similar incidents at multiple hospitals, nursing homes, and medical facilities throughout the city. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with my background in mapping epidemic spread through geographical analysis. The initial outbreak had started in the warehouse district, but it was following predictable population movement patterns outward from that central point. People who were injured or became ill naturally moved toward medical facilities, which meant every hospital in the city was about to become a concentration point for whatever this infection was. I reached the service elevator and used it to access the fourth floor, where Miguel's room was located. The corridor was in complete chaos. Emergency lighting had kicked in because someone had damaged the main electrical panels, casting everything in a red glow that made the blood on the walls look black. Bodies were scattered throughout the hallway, but some of them were still moving. This is when I first realized that death wasn't stopping the infection. The people who had been killed by the infected patients were getting back up and joining the attacks. It violated everything I understood about human biology, but I was watching it happen right in front of me. A nurse who had obviously been dead for at least 20 minutes based on the amount of blood loss was crawling across the floor, snapping at anything that moved. I applied the same stealth techniques I'd learned during solo surveying expeditions in areas with dangerous wildlife. Move slowly, avoid sudden motions, stay downwind when possible, and always have an escape route planned. The infected seemed to be attracted primarily to sound and movement, so I kept close to the walls and moved only when they were distracted by other stimuli. Miguel's room was at the end of the corridor, and I could hear him in there making the same aggressive sounds as the other infected. My heart sank, but I forced myself to approach the door systematically. Through the small window, I could see him strapped to the hospital bed, thrashing against the restraints with incredible strength. His eyes had that same vacant, predatory look I'd seen in the emergency room patients. But Miguel was still partially conscious. When he saw me through the window, there was a moment of recognition before the rage took over again. He was trying to tell me something, fighting against whatever was happening to his brain. I couldn't risk entering the room, but I could see him mouthing words. It took me several attempts to understand what he was saying. Get out. Everyone's turning. Started in the basement. Water supply. The basement. That piece of information changed everything. During my surveying work, I'd mapped the utility systems for this part of downtown Phoenix. The hospital's water supply came from the city's main distribution center, which also served the warehouse district where the first cases had appeared. If something had contaminated the water supply, it would explain the rapid spread and the concentration of cases in areas served by that particular distribution network. I pulled out the city utility maps from my satchel and confirmed my suspicions. The water main that served both the warehouse district and the hospital came from the same pumping station. If the contamination had entered the system there, it would follow the water pressure gradients and affect different areas at different times based on their elevation and distance from the source. This information was crucial for survival planning. Areas of the city that used different water sources or had independent well systems would be safer. The elevation maps in my satchel showed several residential areas to the east and north that were served by different utility grids. But getting there would require navigating through parts of the city that were already affected. Miguel managed to mouth one more word before the infection completely took over his consciousness. Radio? He was telling me to use my amateur radio to warn people. As a fellow ham radio operator, he knew that the emergency services frequencies were probably compromised, but the amateur bands might still be functioning. I had to leave him there. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but Miguel was gone. The thing strapped to that hospital bed might have his face and his body, but it wasn't my friend anymore. Staying would only mean becoming infected myself, and that wouldn't help anyone. The journey back to the service elevator was more dangerous because the infected had spread throughout the fourth floor. I used my knowledge of building acoustics to predict where they were congregating. Sound travels differently through institutional buildings, and after years of working in various structures, I'd learned to use echo patterns and reverberation to map spaces I couldn't see directly. I made it back to the service elevator and descended to the third floor, hoping to find a safer route out of the building. But the situation there was even worse. The infection had spread faster on the lower floors, probably because that's where the water contamination would have been most concentrated. The hospital's cafeteria, which used large amounts of water for food preparation, had become a feeding ground for dozens of infected patients and staff members. That's when I discovered something that would prove crucial for long-term survival. The infected were attracted to areas with high concentrations of people, but they seemed to avoid spaces with certain environmental characteristics. Specifically, they stayed away from areas with strong chemical odors, extremely bright lighting, or high-frequency sounds. The hospital's pharmacy had been abandoned by the staff, but none of the infected had entered it. The combination of chemical preservatives and bright fluorescent lighting seemed to create a barrier they wouldn't cross. This gave me an idea for temporary shelter, but it also suggested that certain urban environments might provide natural protection against the infected. I used the pharmacy as a staging area to reassess my situation and plan my next moves. My radio was picking up scattered transmissions from other amateur operators across the city. The news wasn't good. The infection had spread to at least 6 hospitals, multiple schools, and several residential areas served by the contaminated water grid. Emergency services were completely overwhelmed, and the National Guard had been activated but wouldn't arrive until the following morning. More importantly, I was hearing reports that the infection wasn't limited to Phoenix. Similar outbreaks were being reported in Tucson, Flagstaff, and several cities in California and Nevada. The geographical pattern suggested that this wasn't a localized contamination, but something that had been introduced into multiple water systems simultaneously. While I was in the pharmacy, I gathered supplies that might be useful for extended survival. Antibiotics, pain medications, water purification tablets, and anything that could be used for wound treatment. My surveying experience had taught me to always think several steps ahead when it comes to resource management. I also found a more detailed map of the hospital's layout, including the basement levels where Miguel had indicated the contamination started. If I was going to escape safely, I needed to understand how the infection was spreading through the building's infrastructure. The basement map showed connections to the city's utility tunnel network, which meant the infected might be able to spread underground to other buildings. The radio chatter was becoming more organized as amateur operators across the affected areas began coordinating information. I learned that several safe zones had been established in areas with independent water supplies, but reaching them would require crossing large sections of the city that were already compromised. One transmission that caught my attention came from a group of survivors who had barricaded themselves in a radio tower facility north of the city. They were maintaining communication with similar groups across the Southwest and coordinating rescue efforts. The tower's location on high ground and its independent power and water systems made it an ideal staging area for organized resistance. But getting there would require a journey of more than 20 miles through urban terrain that was becoming increasingly dangerous. My maps showed several possible routes, but all of them involved crossing areas that would likely be heavily infected by now. I needed to plan a path that used elevation advantages, avoided major population centers, and took advantage of natural barriers like rivers and highway corridors. The hospital's power failed completely around 2 in the morning. The backup generators kicked in for essential systems, but most of the building was plunged into darkness. This actually worked in my favor because my experience with night navigation gave me advantages that the infected didn't seem to possess. They could move and hunt in the dark, but they couldn't navigate complex terrain or plan strategic routes. I used my compass and the mental map I'd created of the building to navigate back toward the ground floor. The service corridors were still relatively clear, but I could hear the infected moving through the main hallways in increasing numbers. The hospital was becoming a death trap, and I needed to get out before dawn brought new complications. As I made my way toward what I hoped would be a safe exit, I started hearing something that made my blood run cold. The infected were beginning to move in coordinated groups. What had started as random aggressive behavior was evolving into something more organized. They were hunting together, communicating through those inhuman vocalizations, and showing tactical awareness that suggested some level of retained intelligence. This changed everything about escape planning. Individual infected were dangerous but predictable. Coordinated groups would be exponentially more threatening and much harder to avoid using standard stealth techniques. I was going to need every survival skill I'd ever learned, plus some creative applications of my professional knowledge, just to make it through the rest of the night. The sound of breaking glass from the main lobby told me that the infected had breached the hospital's main entrances. The building was now completely compromised, and I was trapped inside with hundreds of infected patients, staff members, and visitors. My only advantage was my knowledge of the building's layout and my experience with emergency navigation techniques. That's when I heard Miguel screaming again from somewhere deep in the hospital corridors, and I realized that things were about to get much, much worse. Miguel's screaming had changed. It wasn't the confused rage of someone fighting the infection anymore. This was something far worse. The sound was coming from multiple locations throughout the hospital, which meant either Miguel had somehow escaped his restraints and was moving through the building, or there were now multiple infected making the same vocalizations. Neither possibility was good news for my survival. I needed to reach the hospital's roof. During my initial survey of the building, I'd noticed that the hospital had a helicopter landing pad on the 7th floor, which meant roof access and potentially the best vantage point for understanding what was happening across the city. More importantly, getting to higher ground would give me tactical advantages that my surveying experience had taught me to value in dangerous situations. The service elevator was still functioning on backup power, but using it would make noise that could attract the infected. I decided to take the maintenance stairwell instead. It was slower and more physically demanding, but it gave me better control over my movement and multiple escape options if I encountered problems. As I climbed the stairwell, I could hear the infection spreading through the hospital's main areas. The coordinated hunting behavior I'd observed earlier was becoming more pronounced. Groups of infected were moving through the corridors in what sounded like organized search patterns. They weren't just randomly wandering anymore. They were actively hunting for survivors, and they were getting better at it. Between the 3rd and 4th floors, I encountered my first real test of survival skills. A group of 3 infected had somehow accessed the stairwell and were blocking my path upward. In the confined space, I couldn't use the avoidance techniques that had worked in the open corridors. I was going to have to find another way past them or find an alternative route. This is where my experience with wildlife encounters during remote surveying became invaluable. When you're working alone in areas with dangerous animals, you learn that direct confrontation is almost always the worst option. Instead, you use environmental factors to create distractions and alternative pathways that allow you to avoid conflict entirely. The stairwell had several features I could use to my advantage. The emergency lighting created strong shadows that could provide concealment. The concrete construction created acoustic effects that could be used to misdirect attention. Most importantly, each floor had emergency exit doors that connected to the main hospital corridors. I used my radio to create a distraction. By setting it to scan mode and increasing the volume, I created enough electronic noise to draw the infected toward the lower floors. While they moved toward the sound source, I slipped past them and continued climbing toward the roof access. But something I heard on the radio during those few seconds changed my entire understanding of the situation. Between the static and emergency broadcasts, I caught a fragment of a military communication. They weren't just dealing with localized outbreaks anymore. The infection had spread across multiple states, and the federal government was implementing something called Containment Protocol 7. I'd never heard of Containment Protocol 7, but military communications protocols follow predictable patterns. Lower-numbered protocols typically involve evacuation and medical response. Higher-numbered protocols involve increasingly drastic measures. Protocol 7 suggested that whatever was happening was being treated as a national security threat requiring extreme response measures. I reached the 6th floor and had to make a critical decision. The roof access was one more level up, but I could hear helicopter activity outside the building. Military helicopters, based on the rotor signature and flight patterns. If they were implementing containment protocols, those helicopters might not be there for rescue operations. Through a window on the 6th floor, I got my first clear view of Phoenix since the outbreak began. The city was burning, not just individual buildings, but entire neighborhoods. The fires were concentrated in the areas I'd identified earlier as being served by the contaminated water grid. But the pattern of destruction suggested something more systematic than random violence. The warehouse district, where the first cases had appeared, was completely engulfed in flames. The fires were spreading in a pattern that followed the major roadways and utility corridors, which meant they were probably being set deliberately to create fire breaks and contain the spread of infection. Military containment doctrine includes the use of controlled burns to limit the movement of biological threats. I could see military checkpoints being established at major highway intersections, with vehicles being turned away from the affected areas. The radio tower facility I'd heard about earlier was still operational, based on the antenna lights I could see on the northern horizon, but the routes between the hospital and that location were now blocked by military cordons. This information forced me to completely revise my escape planning. I wasn't just trying to avoid infected civilians anymore. I was now operating in what appeared to be an active military containment zone. Getting out of the hospital was only the first step. Surviving long enough to reach a truly safe area would require navigating around military checkpoints and avoiding whatever containment measures they were implementing. I made it to the roof access and found that the door was already propped open. Someone else had reached the roof before me, which could mean either other survivors or infected who had learned to operate simple mechanisms. I approached the roof entrance carefully, using my compass to maintain orientation and listening for any sounds that might indicate what I was about to encounter. The helicopter landing pad was empty, but there were signs that aircraft had been there recently. Fuel stains, equipment marks, and what looked like medical supply packaging scattered around the landing zone. More concerning were the bloodstains and torn clothing that suggested violent encounters had taken place on the roof. From the roof, I could see the full scope of what was happening to Phoenix. The infection had spread much farther than I'd realized from the radio reports. Nearly half the metropolitan area showed signs of chaos, with fires, abandoned vehicles, and what appeared to be large groups of people moving through the streets in unnatural patterns. But I also saw something that gave me hope. There were definite safe zones where lights were still functioning normally, and helicopter traffic was maintaining regular patterns. These areas corresponded to parts of the city that used different water sources or had independent utility systems. My maps and knowledge of Phoenix's infrastructure were giving me information that could mean the difference between life and death. I spread out my city utility maps on the roof and used my surveying experience to plot potential escape routes. The key was avoiding areas served by the contaminated water grid while staying clear of the military containment zones. There were 3 possible routes that met these criteria, but all of them required crossing significant distances through urban terrain at night. The radio traffic was becoming more organized as military units coordinated their containment efforts. I learned that they were establishing a primary quarantine perimeter approximately 15 miles from the original outbreak center. Anyone found outside the perimeter after dawn would be considered a potential infection vector and treated accordingly. The implications of that statement were clear enough. I also picked up communications from the amateur radio network that had been coordinating survivor information. They were reporting that the infection wasn't limited to water contamination anymore. People who had never been exposed to the water supply were becoming infected through contact with infected individuals. The disease was adapting and spreading through multiple transmission vectors. This evolution in the infection pattern meant that my survival planning had to account for airborne transmission, contact transmission, and possibly other vectors that hadn't been identified yet. The safe zones I'd identified based on water supply independence might not remain safe if the infection continued to adapt. While I was studying the maps and radio reports, I heard footsteps in the stairwell below the roof access. Someone or something was climbing toward my position. Based on the rhythm and weight of the steps, it was probably human rather than infected, but I couldn't take any chances. I positioned myself where I could observe the roof entrance while maintaining multiple escape options. If it was another survivor, I wanted to help them. If it was infected, I needed to avoid confrontation while preserving my strategic position. If it was military personnel, I needed to assess whether they were operating under rescue protocols or containment protocols. The person who emerged from the stairwell was Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician who had been treating Miguel. She was injured, exhausted, and carrying an emergency medical kit, but she was still human. Her first words when she saw me confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect about the hospital's situation. "The entire building is compromised," she said. "The infection spread through the water system into every room that has plumbing. Patients, staff, visitors, everyone who consumed anything from the hospital water supply. I've been treating bite victims all night, and I'm telling you that the infection timeline is accelerating. People are turning in minutes now instead of hours." Dr. Chen had managed to reach the roof using the main stairwells, but she'd encountered infected on every floor. More disturbing was her report that the infected were exhibiting increasingly complex behavior. They were using tools, opening doors, and showing problem-solving abilities that suggested significant retained cognitive function. She also confirmed my suspicions about the military response. Hospital evacuation helicopters had stopped coming after midnight, and the last military aircraft she'd seen were spraying something over the warehouse district. When I told her about Containment Protocol 7 and the quarantine perimeter, she understood immediately that we were on our own. Together, we used my maps and her medical knowledge to develop a more comprehensive survival plan. Dr. Chen knew which areas of the city had medical facilities with independent water supplies, and she had contacts in the amateur radio network who were coordinating survivor groups. Combining her information with my geographical analysis gave us options that neither of us could have developed alone. The most promising possibility was a veterinary research facility about 12 miles northeast of the hospital. It had its own well water system, independent power generation, and medical supplies that could be useful for treating injuries or infections. More importantly, it was located in an area that would be outside the military quarantine perimeter, but still within range of the amateur radio network. Getting there would require crossing the most dangerous part of our journey during the hours just before dawn, when infected activity typically peaks and military patrols would be most active. We would need to move through residential areas that were probably already compromised, while avoiding main roads that were likely to be monitored or blocked. Dr. Chen had one more piece of information that changed our planning significantly. During her escape from the hospital, she discovered that the infected were using the hospital's underground tunnel connections to spread into adjacent buildings. The utility tunnel network I'd identified earlier wasn't just a potential escape route. It was also serving as a distribution system for the infection. This meant that any building connected to the underground infrastructure was potentially compromised, regardless of its water source. The infection was spreading through multiple pathways simultaneously, making it much harder to predict safe areas using conventional analysis. We spent the next hour developing contingency plans and backup routes, while monitoring radio traffic for changes in the situation. The military quarantine perimeter was expanding faster than initially announced, which meant we had less time to escape the containment zone than we'd originally calculated. Around 4 in the morning, we began hearing a new type of infected vocalization from inside the hospital. It wasn't the random snarling and moaning we'd been hearing all night. This was rhythmic, almost like chanting, and it was coming from multiple locations simultaneously. The infected were communicating with each other in ways that suggested organizational structure. Dr. Chen had seen similar behavior in the emergency room just before she escaped. Groups of infected had begun moving in formation, with some individuals appearing to direct the actions of others. The infection wasn't just changing people physically. It was creating some kind of collective intelligence that retained human cognitive abilities while eliminating human empathy and social constraints. This development made our escape exponentially more dangerous. We weren't just avoiding mindless predators anymore. We were dealing with intelligent, coordinated hunters who were actively adapting their tactics based on our behavior. Every survival technique I'd learned was designed for dealing with predictable threats, not evolving ones. As dawn approached, we could see military aircraft increasing their activity over the quarantine zone. The helicopters were flying in patterns that suggested systematic reconnaissance, and there were larger aircraft at higher altitudes that looked like they might be conducting surveillance or preparing for larger-scale operations. We made the decision to begin our escape attempt while we still had darkness for concealment. The route we'd planned would take us through residential areas to the northeast, using drainage channels and utility corridors to avoid main roads. It was approximately a 6-hour journey if we maintained good pace and didn't encounter major obstacles. Just as we were preparing to leave the roof, my radio picked up a transmission that made both of us freeze. It was a military communication announcing the implementation of Sterilization Protocol Alpha for the entire quarantine zone. The transmission included coordinates that encompassed not just the infected areas, but the entire Central Phoenix metropolitan region. Dr. Chen understood the implications immediately. Sterilization protocols in military containment doctrine typically involve the complete elimination of biological threats through whatever means necessary. We weren't just escaping from infected civilians anymore. We were escaping from a zone that was about to be subjected to systematic destruction, designed to eliminate all biological activity. We had perhaps hours before whatever sterilization measures they were planning would be implemented. Getting to safety wasn't just about avoiding infected and military patrols anymore. It was about outrunning a countdown that we couldn't see but that would determine whether we lived or died. From that rooftop, I could see the whole city burning, and I realized that my maps and navigation skills weren't just going to help us escape. They were going to determine whether anyone in Phoenix survived what was coming next. Dr. Chen and I descended from the hospital roof using the same maintenance stairwell I'd climbed earlier, but the building had changed dramatically in just a few hours. The coordinated vocalizations we'd heard from the roof were now echoing throughout the entire structure, creating an acoustic environment that suggested hundreds of infected were moving through the hospital in organized groups. My experience with wilderness navigation had taught me to use sound as a mapping tool, and what I was hearing told me that the infected had divided the building into territories. Different groups were controlling different floors and sections, with distinct vocalization patterns that seemed to serve as identification or communication signals. This level of organization was far beyond anything we'd observed earlier in the night. We made it to the ground floor without direct contact, but getting out of the building required crossing areas that were actively patrolled by infected groups. The main entrances were completely blocked by infected, who seemed to be specifically guarding exit points. They weren't just randomly congregating there. They were posted as sentries, I used my knowledge of the hospital's connection to the city's utility tunnel system to find an alternative exit. The basement level had access points to the underground infrastructure that most people never knew existed. During my surveying work, I'd mapped these tunnels for various municipal projects, and I knew they connected to storm drainage systems that could provide concealed movement routes through the city. The basement was flooded with about 6 inches of contaminated water from burst pipes and damaged infrastructure. Wading through it meant potential exposure to whatever agent had caused the initial outbreak. But staying in the hospital meant certain death when the military sterilization protocols were implemented. We used plastic sheeting from medical supply packages to create improvised protection for our legs and feet. The tunnel access was exactly where my maps indicated, but the tunnels themselves had become highways for infected movement. We could hear them traveling through the underground network in large groups, using the same infrastructure I'd hoped would provide us with safe passage. The infection had adapted to use every available route through the city's infrastructure. We had to completely revise our escape strategy. Instead of using the underground network, we would need to move through surface streets while avoiding both infected patrols and military surveillance. This meant using residential areas with complex terrain that would provide concealment while staying away from major roads that might be monitored. Dr. Chen's medical knowledge became crucial for understanding the infection's behavior patterns. She explained that the accelerated turning times we'd observed suggested the pathogen was rapidly evolving to become more efficient at neural takeover. The retention of cognitive functions while eliminating empathy and social constraints created infected, who were essentially sociopathic versions of their former selves. This explained the organizational behavior we'd witnessed. The infected retained their human intelligence and problem-solving abilities, but they'd lost all inhibitions against violence and predatory behavior. They could plan, coordinate, and adapt their tactics because they were still fundamentally human in terms of cognitive capacity. We emerged from the hospital through a service entrance that connected to the loading dock area. The immediate vicinity was clear of infected, but we could see groups moving through the surrounding streets in search patterns that covered every possible escape route from the hospital complex. They knew people were trying to escape, and they were systematically hunting for survivors. I used my compass and the mental map I'd developed of the surrounding area to plot a route that would take advantage of elevation changes and natural barriers. Phoenix's residential areas were built on a grid system, but the underlying topography created drainage patterns and sight line interruptions that could be used for concealment. The first part of our journey took us through a residential neighborhood that showed signs of systematic infection spread. Houses that were connected to the contaminated water grid showed evidence of violence and chaos, while homes with independent well systems appeared to be intact but abandoned. The correlation between water source and infection status was unmistakable. We encountered our first group of infected civilians about 2 miles from the hospital. They were moving through the neighborhood in a formation that reminded me of military search patterns, checking each house systematically for survivors. Their behavior was purposeful and coordinated, with individuals taking specific roles within the group structure. I applied wildlife avoidance techniques to keep us ahead of their search pattern. By using my knowledge of how search teams move through terrain, I could predict their route and stay in areas they'd already cleared or wouldn't reach for several hours. It was like playing a deadly game of chess where the pieces were constantly moving and the stakes were our lives. Dr. Chen was struggling with the physical demands of cross-country movement, but she was providing crucial intelligence about infected behavior. Her medical training allowed her to recognize signs of infection progression and predict how different individuals would behave based on their stage of neural takeover. Around 6 in the morning, we encountered something that changed our understanding of the infection scope. We found a family that had barricaded themselves in their home and successfully avoided infection for the entire night. The father was a retired military engineer who had recognized the water contamination early and switched to stored bottled water for his family. This family became our first example of successful civilian resistance to the outbreak. They'd identified the transmission vector, implemented countermeasures, and maintained defensive positions that allowed them to survive while their entire neighborhood was compromised. Most importantly, they had information about other survivor groups and safe areas that wasn't available through radio communications. The engineer, whose name was Robert Martinez, had been monitoring military communications using equipment left over from his service days. He confirmed that Sterilization Protocol Alpha involved systematic destruction of the entire quarantine zone, using incendiary weapons designed to eliminate all biological material. The operation was scheduled to begin at noon, which gave us approximately 6 hours to reach the outer perimeter. Martinez also had detailed information about the quarantine perimeter's actual boundaries, which extended much farther than the initial radio reports had indicated. The safe zone we'd been trying to reach was actually inside the sterilization area. We needed to revise our destination to areas much farther from the city center. His family had been in contact with a network of survivor groups who were coordinating through shortwave radio frequencies that weren't being monitored by military communications. These groups had identified several locations outside the quarantine zone that were suitable for long-term survival, including the veterinary research facility Dr. Chen and I had targeted. But Martinez provided information that was even more valuable than location data. He'd been tracking the infection spread patterns and had identified geographical factors that seemed to provide natural resistance to infected groups. Areas with certain soil compositions, elevation characteristics, and environmental conditions were showing significantly lower infection rates. This data aligned with my own observations about infected behavior in different environmental conditions. The chemical odors and bright lighting that had deterred infected in the hospital corresponded to naturally occurring conditions in certain parts of the Phoenix metropolitan area. Understanding these patterns could help us choose routes and destinations that provided inherent protection. Martinez's family decided to join our group, which increased our numbers to 5 people, but also brought valuable skills and equipment. His wife Maria was a nurse practitioner who could provide medical care for injuries, and their teenage children had been trained in basic survival and radio operation techniques. Together, we represented a survivor group with complementary skills that could function effectively in long-term survival situations. My navigation and terrain analysis, Dr. Chen's medical knowledge, Martinez's military experience and communication equipment, Maria's healthcare capabilities, and the children's technical skills created a team that was much more capable than the sum of its individual members. We spent an hour at the Martinez house consolidating supplies and refining our escape plan. The additional radio equipment allowed us to monitor multiple communication channels simultaneously, giving us better intelligence about both military operations and infected group movements. We also gathered maps, medical supplies, and survival equipment that would be essential for extended operations outside the quarantine zone. The updated plan involved moving northeast through residential areas to reach higher elevation terrain that would provide tactical advantages and environmental conditions that were less favorable to infected groups. The route was longer than our original plan, but it avoided major concentrations of infected and stayed clear of military patrol routes. Martinez had identified a series of waypoints where other survivor groups had established temporary camps or supply caches. These locations were connected by radio networks that allowed for coordination and mutual support. Reaching them would require crossing approximately 15 miles of compromised terrain, but it would connect us to a larger survival community. As we prepared to leave the Martinez house, we received radio intelligence that the infection had spread to multiple other cities across the Southwest. Similar outbreaks were occurring in Tucson, Las Vegas, Albuquerque, and Denver, all following the same pattern of water supply contamination, followed by rapid evolution to multiple transmission vectors. This information suggested that we were dealing with a coordinated attack rather than a natural disease outbreak. The simultaneous targeting of multiple water systems across such a wide geographical area required planning and resources that indicated state-level involvement. The infection wasn't just a medical crisis anymore. It was biological warfare being conducted against American cities. The implications were staggering. If this was an intentional attack, then the military's sterilization protocols might be justified as a response to a national security threat. But it also meant that similar attacks might be occurring or planned for other parts of the country. Surviving the immediate crisis would only be the beginning of a much larger struggle. We began our movement through the residential areas around 7 in the morning, using the early morning light to improve our navigation, while maintaining concealment in areas with complex terrain. The infected were less active during daylight hours, but they weren't completely dormant. Their search patterns had changed to focus on areas where survivors were most likely to be hiding. About 3 miles into our journey, we encountered evidence that other survivor groups were moving through the same area. Markings on buildings, supply caches, and radio equipment indicated that an organized evacuation was underway. Civilian resistance to the outbreak was more extensive and better coordinated than either the military or the infected group seemed to realize. This discovery gave us hope, but it also increased the danger of our situation. If civilian resistance groups were operating in the area, military forces might increase their surveillance and containment efforts. We might find ourselves caught between infected hunters, military patrols, and friendly fire from other survivor groups who didn't recognize us as allies. The terrain we were crossing showed clear evidence of the infection's environmental preferences. Areas with certain geological characteristics, water table depths, and soil compositions showed much higher rates of infection and more aggressive infected behavior. My surveying experience allowed me to recognize these patterns and adjust our route to avoid the most dangerous environmental conditions. Around 9 in the morning, we reached an elevated position that allowed us to observe a significant portion of the quarantine zone. The scale of destruction was far greater than what we'd seen from the hospital roof. Entire neighborhoods were burning, military checkpoints were under attack by large groups of infected, and aircraft were conducting systematic reconnaissance of all remaining structures. But we also saw evidence of successful resistance. There were areas where survivor groups had established defensive positions and were maintaining organized resistance to both infected attacks and military containment efforts. Smoke signals, radio antennas, and coordinated movement patterns indicated that civilian survival networks were more extensive than anyone had realized. Martinez's radio equipment picked up communications from one of these resistance groups, and we learned that they were planning to evacuate hundreds of survivors through routes that avoided both infected concentrations and military checkpoints. They had vehicles, heavy equipment, and enough firepower to fight their way through significant opposition. The resistance group was requesting navigation assistance for their evacuation convoy, and they specifically needed someone with detailed knowledge of the terrain they would be crossing. My surveying experience and map collection made me exactly the kind of specialist they needed, but joining them would mean abandoning our small group strategy in favor of a large-scale evacuation attempt. We had to make a critical decision: continue with our planned route to the veterinary research facility, or rendezvous with the resistance convoy and help guide hundreds of people to safety. Both options had significant risks, but the resistance convoy offered the possibility of saving many more lives while potentially improving our own survival chances. As we debated our options, military aircraft began flying systematic patterns over our area, and we realized that the sterilization protocol countdown was accelerating. Whatever we decided, we needed to implement it immediately, because the window for escape was closing faster than we'd anticipated. We made the decision to rendezvous with the resistance convoy. The potential to save hundreds of lives outweighed the increased risks of joining a larger group, and my navigation expertise could make the difference between successful evacuation and catastrophic failure. Martinez's radio equipment allowed us to coordinate with the convoy leadership and establish a meeting point at an abandoned shopping center about 4 miles from our current position. The journey to the rendezvous point required crossing the most dangerous terrain we'd encountered since leaving the hospital. The infected had established control over several major intersections, creating choke points that forced all movement through areas they could monitor and ambush. My surveying experience became crucial for identifying alternative routes that used natural terrain features to avoid these killing zones. I applied the same principles I'd used for wilderness navigation, but adapted them for urban warfare conditions. Drainage systems became concealed highways. Elevation changes provided observation points and cover from detection. Even the city's landscaping could be used to mask movement and provide temporary shelter from both infected patrols and military surveillance. The infected groups we encountered during this phase showed even more sophisticated organization than what we'd observed earlier. They were using abandoned vehicles to create roadblocks, positioning sentries at strategic observation points, and communicating through complex vocalization patterns that suggested they were coordinating operations across multiple square miles of territory. The infection had transformed ordinary civilians into an intelligent predator species that retained human cognitive abilities while losing all human moral constraints. Dr. Chen's medical knowledge continued to provide vital intelligence about infected behavior patterns. She'd observed that infected individuals retained specific professional skills from their previous lives, which made them exponentially more dangerous than simple predators. Infected police officers retained tactical training. Infected medical personnel could recognize and exploit human vulnerabilities, and infected civilians with military backgrounds organized other infected into effective combat units. This retention of professional skills explained the increasingly sophisticated resistance we were encountering from infected groups. They weren't just hunting randomly anymore. They were conducting military-style operations with clear objectives and coordinated tactics. The infection had created an enemy force that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts and complete lack of moral constraints. During our movement toward the rendezvous point, we encountered evidence that the infected were adapting their tactics based on survivor behavior patterns. Areas where previous escape attempts had occurred showed signs of prepared ambush positions and modified terrain designed to funnel survivors into killing zones. The infected were learning from each encounter and improving their hunting strategies. The Martinez family proved invaluable during this phase of our escape. Robert's military experience helped us recognize and avoid tactical situations where infected groups had set up ambushes or crossfire zones. His knowledge of urban warfare principles allowed us to identify safe routes through terrain that appeared completely compromised to civilian observation. Maria's medical training allowed her to treat injuries we sustained during movement, including cuts from broken glass, bruises from falls, and stress-related symptoms that were affecting our performance. Her ability to provide immediate medical care meant we could maintain operational effectiveness even when sustaining minor injuries that would otherwise slow our progress. The Martinez children, despite their young age, proved remarkably capable at operating radio equipment and maintaining communication with multiple survivor groups simultaneously. Their technical skills and familiarity with communication protocols allowed us to coordinate our movement with other groups and receive real-time intelligence about changing conditions throughout the quarantine zone. Around 10:30 in the morning, we encountered our first military patrol. A squad of soldiers was conducting systematic searches of abandoned buildings, but their behavior suggested they were operating under containment protocols rather than rescue missions. They were treating all civilian contact as potential infection risks, which meant approaching them could be as dangerous as encountering infected groups. The soldiers were equipped with biological protection gear and weapons systems that were designed for eliminating infected targets rather than providing medical assistance to survivors. Their movement patterns and communication protocols indicated they were conducting final clearance operations in preparation for area sterilization, rather than evacuation assistance for civilian survivors. I used my knowledge of military patrol patterns to keep us ahead of their search grid while maintaining progress toward the rendezvous point. The soldiers were following predictable routes based on standard urban warfare doctrine, which made their movements easier to anticipate than the adaptive tactics used by infected groups. Military units operate according to established procedures that can be predicted if you understand their tactical doctrine. But the military presence also indicated that time was running out faster than we'd calculated. If patrol units were conducting final sweeps of civilian areas, it meant the sterilization protocols could be implemented ahead of schedule. We needed to reach the convoy and begin evacuation immediately, not wait for the noon deadline we'd been planning around. The terrain between our position and the rendezvous point included several geographical features that would provide advantages for our movement, while creating obstacles for both infected and military pursuit. A series of drainage channels ran northeast through residential areas, providing concealed routes that were below ground level and difficult to observe from aircraft or elevated positions. These drainage systems were part of Phoenix's flood control infrastructure, designed to handle seasonal rainfall that could create dangerous flash flooding conditions. During dry periods, they provided hidden highways that could be used for concealed movement across significant distances. My surveying work had included mapping these systems for municipal planning purposes, so I knew their routes, access points, and structural characteristics. The abandoned shopping center where we were meeting the convoy showed evidence of recent occupation by survivor groups. Supply caches, communication equipment, and defensive preparations indicated that civilian resistance had been using the location as a staging area for evacuation operations. But it also showed signs of recent combat, with damage patterns that suggested both infected attacks and military engagement. When we arrived at the rendezvous point, we found a convoy of more than 30 vehicles carrying approximately 200 survivors. The convoy leadership included former military personnel, medical professionals, and civilians with specialized skills that were essential for long-term survival operations. Most importantly, they had detailed intelligence about safe areas outside the quarantine zone and supply networks that could support large groups. The convoy commander was a retired Army colonel named Patricia Williams, who had been coordinating civilian resistance efforts since the early hours of the outbreak. She'd recognized the biological warfare nature of the attack before military leadership acknowledged it, and she'd been organizing evacuation operations that operated independently of official emergency response protocols. Colonel Williams had served in biological warfare defense units during her military career, which gave her expertise in recognizing and responding to biological attacks that most civilian and military personnel lacked. Her experience with biological containment procedures allowed her to identify the artificial characteristics of the outbreak pattern and recognize that the official response was designed to eliminate evidence rather than provide assistance. She'd been monitoring military communications since the outbreak began and had documented evidence that the sterilization protocols were being implemented according to predetermined plans, rather than as emergency responses to unexpected biological threats. The timing, resources, and coordination required for the military response indicated advanced planning that preceded the outbreak by months or years. Colonel Williams confirmed that similar convoys were operating in other affected cities, and that a larger resistance network was coordinating survival operations across the entire region. The attack had targeted multiple cities simultaneously, but civilian resistance had adapted faster than the attackers had anticipated. Survivor groups were not only escaping the quarantine zones, but were establishing the infrastructure for long-term resistance operations. My maps and surveying experience immediately proved valuable to the convoy's navigation planning. The route they'd originally planned would have taken them through terrain that was highly favorable to infected ambush tactics, with multiple choke points and limited visibility. Using my topographical knowledge, we identified alternative routes that used elevation advantages and natural barriers to provide tactical superiority during movement. More importantly, my knowledge of the region's infrastructure allowed us to identify supply points and defensive positions that weren't marked on standard military maps. Abandoned surveying stations, geological research facilities, and utility infrastructure sites could provide resources and shelter that wouldn't be targeted by either infected groups or military forces. The convoy's vehicles included modified trucks, armored civilian vehicles, and equipment that had been acquired from abandoned military and police facilities. The survivor group had managed to obtain weapons, communication equipment, and medical supplies that would support extended operations in hostile territory. They'd essentially become a mobile resistance force capable of independent operations. The convoy's communication network was intercepting military traffic that confirmed our worst fears about the sterilization timeline. Aircraft were already in position to begin operations, and ground units were conducting final evacuations of military personnel from the quarantine zone. We had perhaps 2 hours to clear the perimeter before systematic destruction began. But we also learned something that changed our understanding of the entire situation. The military communications included references to secondary targets and Phase 2 implementation. The attack on Phoenix wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening phase of a larger operation that would target additional cities across the Southwest and potentially the entire country. Intelligence intercepts suggested that similar biological attacks were planned for Los Angeles, Denver, Dallas, and Atlanta within the following weeks. Each attack would follow the same pattern of water supply contamination, followed by military containment and sterilization operations. The goal appeared to be systematic elimination of major American population centers under the cover of biological warfare response. This intelligence transformed our mission from simple survival to strategic resistance. We weren't just escaping a localized disaster anymore. We were positioning ourselves to resist a coordinated attack on American civilian populations. The skills and knowledge that had helped us survive the initial outbreak would be essential for long-term resistance operations. Dr. Chen's medical expertise became crucial for understanding the long-term implications of the biological attack. The pathogen that had caused the initial outbreak was engineered to target specific genetic markers that were common in certain population groups. The attack wasn't just indiscriminate biological warfare. It was targeted genocide disguised as a disease outbreak. This revelation explained the geographical pattern of infection spread and the environmental factors that seemed to provide resistance. The pathogen was designed to be most effective in areas with specific demographic compositions, which correlated with certain infrastructure patterns and environmental conditions. Understanding these factors could help us identify safe areas and predict future attack patterns. The biological agent showed characteristics that could only have been developed in advanced laboratory facilities with access to classified research data. The sophistication of the pathogen and its delivery systems indicated involvement by government agencies, with access to biological warfare research programs that were supposed to have been terminated decades ago. Dr. Chen's analysis of tissue samples and infection progression data suggested that the pathogen had been under development for years and had been tested in controlled environments before being deployed against civilian populations. The attack on Phoenix was essentially a field test of biological weapons that would be used for larger-scale operations. The convoy began moving at 11:15, using routes I'd planned that avoided both infected concentrations and military observation points. The evacuation required crossing approximately 40 miles of compromised terrain to reach safe areas outside the quarantine perimeter. But our route used terrain features that provided natural advantages for convoy operations. My navigation planning proved effective during the first phase of movement. We avoided major infected concentrations and stayed ahead of military patrol schedules, making steady progress toward the perimeter. The convoy moved in sections, with communication between vehicle groups maintained through radio equipment that operated on frequencies that weren't being monitored by military units. But as we approached the quarantine boundary, we encountered something that none of our intelligence had prepared us for. The military had established a secondary perimeter beyond the official quarantine zone, and this outer boundary was designed to prevent survivors from escaping rather than containing the infection. Units positioned along escape routes were operating under orders to eliminate civilian groups attempting to leave the quarantine area. This discovery confirmed that we were dealing with a coordinated conspiracy involving elements of the military command structure. The biological attack had been planned and implemented by forces within the government, and the containment operations were designed to eliminate evidence and prevent survivors from exposing the truth about what had happened. The secondary perimeter included checkpoints, patrol routes, and surveillance systems that were designed to intercept and eliminate civilian survivors, rather than provide assistance or evacuation support. Military units had been positioned with overlapping fields of fire and communication networks that allowed them to coordinate responses to survivor groups attempting to escape. Colonel Williams had anticipated this possibility and had developed contingency plans for fighting through military checkpoints. The convoy included vehicles with armor modifications and weapons systems that could engage military units if necessary. We were prepared to fight American soldiers who were operating under orders to kill American civilians. The first engagement occurred at a checkpoint approximately 10 miles from the safe zone perimeter. Military units attempted to stop the convoy for decontamination processing, but intelligence from other survivor groups had warned us that decontamination facilities were actually elimination sites. No civilians who entered military decontamination had ever been seen again. I used my terrain knowledge to identify positions where the convoy could establish tactical superiority over the checkpoint. Elevation advantages, natural cover, and multiple escape routes allowed us to engage the military units while maintaining options for withdrawal if the engagement went badly. The fighting was brief but intense. Military units that were expecting to process helpless refugee groups found themselves engaging a well-armed and tactically competent resistance force. Our navigation advantages and knowledge of local terrain allowed us to outmaneuver professional soldiers who were operating in unfamiliar territory. After breaking through the checkpoint, we continued toward the safe zone using routes that avoided other military positions. My maps identified paths through terrain that was unsuitable for military vehicle operations, forcing any pursuit to operate on foot in areas where civilian knowledge of local conditions provided significant advantages. We reached the safe zone perimeter around 1 in the afternoon, approximately an hour after the sterilization operations had begun in the quarantine zone. Behind us, we could see aircraft conducting systematic destruction of the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. The attack had succeeded in eliminating a major American city, but it had also created a resistance movement that understood the true nature of the threat. The safe zone was actually a network of survivor communities that had been established in areas with geographical and infrastructure characteristics that provided natural resistance to biological attack. These communities were connected by communication networks and supply systems that operated independently of government-controlled infrastructure. Most importantly, the survivor network had preserved evidence of the biological attack and the military's role in implementing it. Documentation, communication intercepts, and survivor testimony created a record that could expose the conspiracy and prevent similar attacks on other cities. My surveying skills and geographical knowledge had proven essential not just for survival, but for establishing the infrastructure that would support long-term resistance operations. The maps and terrain analysis that had saved our lives during the escape were now being used to plan defensive positions and supply networks for communities that would resist future attacks. The knowledge that had saved our lives was now being used to save our country.